Welcome to the Crux. I am joined today by the spectacular Dr. Naomi Win, world touring violinist, behavioral finance specialist, author, and all-around awesome person. Thank you for joining me, Naomi.
Happy to be here.
So you've spoken about advisors who are trying to capture the next generation's assets, but at the same time looking down at them as degenerate gamblers for engaging in polymarkets, crypto, meme stocks, things like that. How much of this risk-taking is just the general arrogance of youth in a generation that has access to tools for investing that are brand new and never seen before? And how much of this is a disaffection and feeling that they won't have the same opportunities as older generations?
It's a good question. It's a big question. I think the answer is both. I think that youth does afford a particular kind of arrogance in the form of like risk tolerance, for example, but it also has that myopia that's afforded by feeling much farther away from death. Add that to the familiarity with tech that puts kind of market in your hands. It's no wonder we get millennials or Gen Z, I guess, kind of eyeing plans to 10x their investments by betting on whether Trump says the word tampon to Elon Musk, which is a real polymarket bet that I encountered a while ago too. So it makes sense to me that wealth managers would feel dismissive of this way of thinking as if it's just like a current phenotype of, I don't know, speculative fad. Don't get me wrong. I do find the Bored Ape crypto bro aesthetic really repellent, both philosophically and ideologically. But to dismiss the impetus that gives that strategy purchase on this generation is to completely ignore a variable in the wealth management equation. So if advisors want to capture next gen engagement, they would want to look at this in part because I think it speaks to the other part of your question there, because it's a reflection of disaffection, amongst other things. So I think historically, investing has been conceptualized as an inherently optimistic kind of act of faith in the long arm of the market. It's going to bend towards returns. And in connection with that, we have this, you have to believe there's a decent time horizon or have this perspective of risk and returns that sustains long suffering by the promise of reward over that time horizon, which is very rational, but it really loses veracity and kind of downplays experiential gaps that get foregrounded when those kind of conventions are superimposed on what emergent adulthood looks like at the moment. And that, the map's not the territory here. So we have a generation here that's kind of forayed into wealth building, coinciding with like an epoch of real uncertainty that's been, defined by degraded social contract, the erosion of traditional modes of upward mobility. There's, a shredding of faith in the idea that hard work is going to be rewarded, further pressed by these real lack of answers to questions around sustainability. And I don't just mean climate change, but around capital's increasingly explicit demand that public sacrifice be made at the altar of private equity and so forth and so on. So we have this generation that's less worried about establishing a 401k than kind of staying invested and doing traditional things than they are about stockpiling protein bars to trade for like eRaft software updates that they might need in the I don't know, the global warming war 2040 or something. So anyway, long story short, there's a loss of faith in the conditions that make traditional investing appealing. And it's not just like an ignorant youth rebellion against convention. So I think there's a concern that that long arm of the market is just going to be twisted up their back. And so having patience in that looks less like a virtue and more like something people can't afford to cultivate. So I think that sort of leads to this idea that they want to engage in a different way of getting around that system. The system's failed, then we need something else. And so we end up with these Hail Mary attempts there. And I think there's a sense from advisors that I get when I talk to them about this that, it's a vibe that people are going for when they jump in on these kinds of bets. And, feelings aren't facts and conventional investing is the way to go. But I think anybody saying things like that, like feelings aren't facts, it kind of ignores the fact they are covariates. And I think brandishing that bromide as a sort of ensign of investing rationalism is really sort of capping brain function at the knees in a way, because I think the way we feel shapes how we make decisions that do determine the facts. And I think nobody knows that more than people who work in finance, that sentiment shapes the market in certain ways. And I think even a TikTok goldfish following Twitter, White House press release, or even like Tesla stock, for example, in real time over Q1 could tell you just as much. So I think market action, it's happening at the bisect of perception and production. Millennials and Gen Z are really attuned to that. They're really attuned to how projection, whether it's astroturfing or astrology, is really connected to how you get kind of material gain, because we exist in an atmosphere where our desires are sold back to us through this algorithm. And so in a way, it's almost like, how do I capitalize on that? Does that make sense? I'm sorry, did I answer your question there?
No, it's I love it. I love it. And so, I mean, these young people who don't have the notion that I'm going to get a job at GE and work there until I'm at upper management and a long perspective, the idea is I'm going to go work for this startup, then I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And there is a notion of mobility and no real concept of the long job or the long investment.
Yes.
And that is both a letdown and an exciting opportunity.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
And you mentioned sentiment, and there's no one that doesn't have feelings about their current, past, or future financial state. So why is the financial industry so averse to looking at things through a sociological lens? It's as if you are on team behavioral finance or team whatever the opposite of that is, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, hard numbers. Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. It's team econ on BFI at the moment. And I think it's an interesting question, especially where you put that, especially because there is a lot of research at the moment from, Bain, Vanguard, McKinsey, kind of projecting the future of behavioral finance, but also advisors' work and their capacity for tending to clients. And they keep pointing out the idea that advisor value is defined by clients. Clients want to be tended to in terms of financial anxiety. So there really is this sort of intersection of finance and psychology that's come into it's much, much higher relief, but the positioning there is of intersect. Whereas I think academics have really, for a long time, really known academics have theories around economics and sociology, not ecology, sorry, that they're not just dovetailing, they are superimposed. But I think that doesn't really translate to wealth management for a couple of reasons. And I suppose I subscribe to the idea that economics in most ways is actually an expression of sociological phenomena, but it's reduced and it's manifest through a medium of money. But a difference there would be that sociology is looking at relationships that aren't necessarily linear in terms of like causality, for example. So where one, in an economist might be able to slap, I'm being really reductionist here, but an economist might slap up on a PowerPoint, I have exchanged X amount of labor for Y amount of money. Great. But it gets more complex if you put sociology in the mix and say, now I exchange X amount of labor for Y amount of social mobility that's predicated and or limited by my socioeconomic class and culture, that's tied to identity, mental health, as it relies on social services that I've been denied something. That's way more complex. That's not speaking to a bottom line. And in fact, that reminds me, I think there was an article in the New York Times that could have been, I don't know, I'm losing track of how time flows now because I'm getting old, maybe like a decade ago or so. It was asking something about what if sociology was more influential, I think it was, than economics. And they noted in there somewhere, well, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, which I think is a phrase that's sometimes used to kind of imply this sort of ham-fisted, unsophisticated application that's unwanted. But in this case, I think we have an idea that if all we have is per capita gross product purview, then everything's reducible to economics. And that's not considered a problem by the finance world because it's entirely congruent with America's pursuit of never-ending extrapolating profit and forced scarcity leading to returns. All this to say, the sociological lens is inherent to the economic conversation. I do think they are actually superimposed, but there is resistance to bringing that into, foregrounding that because operationalizing it is really difficult for your average retail investor and maybe doesn't have a very clear value add. And secondly, the system we're in it's not built to prioritize that. The financial industry has to run in sync with capitalism. And so the focus through that sociological lens requires deconstruction and rebuilding that integrates in a way that the machine of capital is just not incentivized to do, or at least not at the moment anyway.
But you're here to change that.
We'll see.
Your work revolves around people and their emotional tangles with being an investor creating wealth. But what about working with ultra high net worth clients and solving the problems that wealth has created for them?
I like how you phrase this solving the problem wealth creates, because it is true, wealth does actually create problems in some ways, but it's less commonly encountered than the typical goal of amassing money to solve problems. It's sort of a weird inversion, which I think the way you phrase that points to, a different inflection point. So there are these studies, of course, that have this idea that amassing wealth after a certain point doesn't equate to happiness or solving problems, right? And I think to an extent that's true. I'm definitely of the opinion that the contemporary American dream is currently defined as your ability to buy your way out of American problems, essentially. And if you have enough money to do that, you can buy healthcare, buy your time back, so you can spend it in ways that matter. Yes, fantastic. And then past that point, I don't really know that money is going to make you happier. Something Freud said that I love is he talks about the idea of work and love being the cornerstones of good living. And I agree with that. But if you have enough money, that work can be really personally meaningful. It can be art, it can be growing a garden, taking care of your family. I agree with all of that. So there's actually two inflection points. So there's one where you have enough money in your pocket now that you can do that. The second inflection point is having way more than that amount of money. And it ends up buying your way into a new echelon of problems. And it could be that you end up in a situation where everyone closest to you is on your payroll, leaving you with questions around, well, what kind of loyalty do people have to you as an individual versus loyalty to your net worth? And are people friends with you because you're really lovely, or is it because you have a yacht? And it sounds ridiculous to me in some ways, because in some ways it is. A lot of people would love to have that problem. But on a deeper level, the question being asked there is, am I legitimate as a person? Am I seen? Am I heard? Am I understood? And those questions are pretty painful. So I think especially if you end up with somebody who lacks the psychological flexibility or sense of collective responsibility to struggle through those questions healthily, and then you add extreme wealth, you've just poured petrol on a bonfire. So you end up with something that can look eerily close to psychopathology in an individual. And since wealth often equates to power in America, you also might get the ability to destroy a lot of people's lives just due to your kind of psychological fragility. So on the less dark end of the spectrum, though, we have things like parents working really, really hard and then having a liquidity event that suddenly catapults them into the ultra high net worth strata. And humans don't necessarily do well with that kind of rapid change. So that would put them really far from the mental framing of their roots. So this might look like parents that know instinctively it's really not good for their kids to feel like they have withholding parents, but also they now suddenly have wealth, so they can technically afford for their kids to opt out of earning a living. But should they do that? How do you navigate that? Should they cut them out of inheritance and just give it all to charity? Or how do you cultivate ambition and productivity in kids if they know that you can afford not to? Or do you just not tell them and then have like a betrayal of trust at some point later in the future? And anyway, these are specific paradoxes of, financial dependency, really specific to ultra high net worth, but they are rooted in universal concerns. Again, you're wanting to parent well, wanting to have good relationships and not be kind of reduced to a superficial aspect of your profile. So I think that's kind of the crux of that.
Yeah. We all watch, well, actually, I don't, but I'm aware of the shows of the ultra wealthy, and we as a society idolize them and desire to be like them. But there's that trope: if you put everyone's problems in the middle of the room, you'd probably take back your own than someone else's. So we all have our fragilities and insecurities, and to then incorporate a bunch of money into that and amplify that is kind of terrifying, even though we might say we would want those.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something psychoanalytic there about the fantasy being best left as a fantasy sometimes.
Yes. Naomi, thank you so much. For those who want to follow her work, check her out on Orion, LinkedIn, and where else?
Nowhere. I try to keep as minimal a profile as possible. But you're welcome to email me. I always like a good email.
Awesome. Thank you, Naomi. Take care.
You're welcome. Thank you too. Bye.